Sherlock Holmes must rank as one of the most, if not the most, unromantic characters in all of literature. As he himself told Watson at the conclusion of The Sign of Four, love is an emotional thing, and whatever is emotional is opposed to that true cold reason which I place above all things. I should never marry myself, lest I bias my judgment. And yet romance in its many forms, from the sublime to the horrifying to the just plain weird, plays a surprisingly large role in the Holmes canon. I won't try to cover every romantic episode in every story, and I may leave out some of your personal favorites, but I'd like to look at some of Holmes's encounters with love and its consequences throughout his long career. Not surprisingly, for a collection of stories of crime and detection, the romances in the canon are far more likely to turn out badly, and even fatally in some cases, than they are to lead to happy endings. A whole range of human motivations, from jealousy, greed, and revenge, to selfishness, vanity, and simple cruelty, lead to some pretty appalling behavior. Sometimes third parties are responsible for the wrongdoing, but just as often one of the romantic partners indulges in some less than loving activity. Poets may say that love is the strongest emotion, but sadly, for too many, the strongest love is the love of lucre. Whether through blackmail, the manipulation of an inheritance, or outright theft, in many of the Holmes stories, someone is looking to profit from the tender feelings of our lovers. While blackmail turns up occasionally in the Holmes stories, it is seldom over affairs of the heart. In stories like The Adventure of Black Peter, the blackmail is usually over murder or other crimes. But the most vicious blackmailer in the entire canon specializes in romantic improprieties. Holmes himself describes Charles Augustus Milverton as the worst man in London. Of course, this is after Professor Moriarty has met his watery fate. Heaven help the man, and still more the woman, whose secret and reputation come into the power of Milverton, says Holmes. In the story, Milverton has acquired some letters that were imprudent, nothing worse, from Lady Eva Blackwell to an impecunious young squire in the country. He's threatening to use them to break up her impending marriage to the Earl of Dovercourt. Unable to pay up, Lady Eva has asked Holmes to act as a go-between with Milverton. When he can't make Milverton see reason, Holmes dons a working man's disguise and initiates a romance and even an engagement of his own with Milverton's housemaid to obtain information preparatory to burgling Milverton's home. However, in the midst of the burglary, one of Milverton's previous victims arrives and empties her revolver into his body as Holmes and Watson look on from their hiding place, making no effort to stop or apprehend the killer. This story shows Holmes in a surprisingly unflattering light. He's willing to mislead an unsophisticated housemaid into thinking she is engaged to a respectable plumber, a ruse that seems remarkably cold-hearted even for Holmes. At least, as he assures Watson, he has a hated rival who will cut him out at the first opportunity. Then he's ready to commit the crimes of breaking and entering and theft, and to involve Watson in this clearly illegal scheme. And finally, he seems entirely unconcerned with disrupting a murder or catching the killer. And he exercises none of his vaunted powers of deduction, simply going for a brute force burglary and then allowing a wronged third party to take care of the villain for him. But at least he recovers and destroys a treasure trove of blackmail material, ending Milverton's hold over his victims forever. More than anywhere else in the canon, this seems to be a case where Holmes believes that the end justifies the means. As he tells Watson in excusing his behavior to the housemaid, "You can't help it, my dear Watson. You must play your cards as best you can when such a stake is on the table." In Victorian England, any proper young lady will certainly allow her father to handle her money for her until it's time to turn that duty over to her husband. You don't expect a mere woman to deal with her own finances, do you? In 3 of the stories, fathers or stepfathers try various schemes, from the silly to the murderous, to prevent their daughters from marrying and taking their inheritances with them. In A Case of Identity, the amiable but remarkably unobservant Miss Mary Sutherland hires Holmes to investigate the mysterious disappearance of her fiancé, Hosmer Angel, whom she had met several months before at the gasfitter's ball. I can only imagine that this event must rival a BSI convention for excitement and amorous opportunities. Miss Sutherland's stepfather, Mr. Windibank, is violently opposed to his stepdaughter having any social life. After all, if she married, it would deprive her stepfather of her £100 per year of income inherited from her uncle. So Hosmer can only court Mary in person while Mr. Windibank is away on business, with the rest of their courtship carried on by typed correspondence. So discreet is Mr. Angel that Mary is not even sure exactly where he lives, but in spite of this dearth of personal information, she agrees to marry him, and also agrees to swear never to marry anyone else if anything should come between them. Holmes soon determines that the ardent Mr. Angel is really Mr. Windibank in false whiskers and glasses and a disguised voice, but when he confronts Windibank about the deception, he's forced to admit that no laws have been broken and there's really nothing he can do about it. He even declines to inform Miss Sutherland of the deception, reminding Watson of the old Persian saying about the danger for whoso snatches a delusion from a woman. It sounds like the ancient Persians were no more enlightened than the Victorians. The desire to keep a daughter and her money at home takes a more sinister turn in The Adventure of the Copper Beeches, when the odious Jeffro Rucastle hires Violet Hunter to educate his son and also to perform some rather odd tasks involving an electric blue dress and a very short haircut. The proudly auburn-haired Miss Hunter is rightly suspicious and asks Holmes to investigate. It transpires that Mr. Rucastle has a daughter of Miss Hunter's size, age, and hair color, with some money of her own from an inheritance. Alice, the daughter, has always allowed her father to control her money, but when she meets and plans to marry Mr. Fowler, the father tries to force her to sign over this control to him regardless of her marital state. He worries her into a case of brain fever, an odd Victorian disease which apparently requires the patient's hair to be cut short. I guess this lets the brain cool off or something. Anyway, she eventually recovers, and Mr. Fowler is still as determined as ever to marry her, hair or no hair. So the Rucastles lock up Alice and hire the unsuspecting Violet to unknowingly impersonate her, hence the dress and the buzz cut. They hope that Fowler, spying from the road, will see Alice appearing to be happy and carefree and conclude that she no longer cares for him. Fortunately, he is made of sterner stuff, and he conspires with the housekeeper to rescue Alice from her captivity. Meanwhile, Rucastle himself is nearly killed by the hound that he keeps to deter Fowler from coming on the property. This is one of the romances with a happy ending, as Fowler and Alice marry the day after her rescue. However, Watson is somewhat disappointed that Holmes shows no further interest in Violet after her case has been resolved. From deception in a case of identity to imprisonment in the Copper Beeches, we go all the way to murder in The Adventure of the Speckled Band. Miss Helen Stoner is another young lady whose stepfather retains control of the money she inherited from her late mother so long as she remains unmarried, but loses his claim if she marries. This stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott, is a man of violent temper and great physical strength, who keeps a menagerie of dangerous Indian animals roaming about his estate. Miss Stoner's older sister died under mysterious and terrifying circumstances 2 years earlier, shortly after becoming engaged. So when Helen accepts a proposal of marriage and then starts hearing the same strange whistling noises in the night that her sister complained of before her death, it's not surprising that she suspects she may be headed for a bad end. In one of their most hair-raising adventures, Holmes and Watson discover a bizarre scheme involving a ventilation grate that doesn't ventilate, a bell pull that doesn't ring a bell, and a speckled band with some very venomous fangs at one end. The devious Dr. Roylott has trained his deadly swamp adder to slither from his own bedroom through the grate, down the bell pull, and into his luckless stepdaughter's bed, where he hopes the snake will become alarmed and deliver a fatal bite. But Holmes and Watson, after a nerve-wracking wait in the girl's bedroom, discover the snake and drive it back to Dr. Roylott's room, where it quickly dispatches Roylott instead of its intended prey. Not surprisingly, his death leaves Holmes with an untroubled conscience. You could say this tale ultimately has a happy ending, as Miss Stoner's life is spared and she is duly married to her fiancé with her inheritance intact. However, it's a shame that Holmes was not called in 2 years earlier in time to save Miss Stoner's sister from her grisly fate. Not everybody has a daughter or stepdaughter with an inheritance to be kept away from a prospective son-in-law. Some of our malefactors have to resort to outright theft. Their larcenous plans may involve leading a naive young lady astray through romantic advances, or if romance fails, they may go straight to kidnapping and coerced marriage. Fortunately, Holmes is there to rescue the damsel in distress, or at least to recover the loot. In The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet, an unscrupulous rake takes advantage of his latest romantic conquest to do a little spur-of-the-moment jewel theft. And what jewels they are! An unnamed aristocrat borrows a large sum of money from a prominent banker, Alexander Holder, on the security of one of the most priceless public possessions of the empire, a beautiful beryl coronet. The banker then takes this national treasure home with him rather than leaving it in the bank's safe. What could possibly go wrong? That very night, 3 stones are ripped from the edge of the coronet, and the banker's son, Arthur, is found clutching the mutilated remains. He refuses to explain what he is doing or where the missing gems are. Since he had just asked his father for money to cover gambling debts and been refused, his guilt seems obvious. But of course, Holmes looks beyond the obvious. Holmes's investigation uncovers a love triangle of sorts. Young Arthur is in love with his cousin Mary, who lives in the same household. Unfortunately, Mary is secretly in love with Arthur's friend, Sir George Burnwell, a man of the world possessed of far too much charm and far too little conscience. And Burnwell is in love with money. When the jewels arrive in the household, Mary tells Burnwell about them, and he persuades her to slip them to him in the dead of night. Arthur catches them in the act, pursues Burnwell, and recovers all but 3 of the jewels in the ensuing tug-of-war. His love for Mary prevents him from explaining to his father or the police what really happened, and he ends up in jail. Fortunately, Holmes is able to track down and recover the missing jewels and exonerate Arthur, but in the meantime, Mary foolishly runs off with Burnwell. As Holmes observes, there are women in whom the love of a lover extinguishes all other loves, and I think that she must have been one. He did not add that this love also extinguished all common sense, but that seems to be a commodity in short supply in the entire family. In The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist, another young lady comes into a large inheritance, but this time she doesn't even know about it until it's almost too late. Miss Violet Smith is a music teacher whose father has died, leaving her and her mother in straitened circumstances. She's suddenly contacted by 2 gentlemen, Mr. Carruthers and Mr. Woodley, claiming to be friends of her long-lost uncle, who was last heard of 25 years ago in Africa. They tell her that Uncle Ralph has died penniless, but ask the 2 friends to make sure that Violet was provided for. To this end, Mr. Carruthers hires Violet to teach music to his young daughter at Chiltern Grange, one of those isolated country estates where so many strange and sinister things used to happen to the Victorians. At first, Chiltern Grange seems like a much less bizarre establishment than the Copper Beeches, where another Violet was required to cut off her hair and wear a distinctive blue dress. Our current Violet goes along quite happily, teaching music, dreaming of her upcoming marriage to Cyril, her fiancé, and bicycling to the train station every weekend to visit her mother in London. Unfortunately, Mr. Woodley turns up and starts behaving like the cad that he is, violently wooing Violet until Mr. Carruthers is forced to intervene and gets a knock on the head for his trouble. That ends Woodley's visit, but then Violet starts noticing a mysterious bearded man following her along a very lonely stretch of road as she cycles to the train station each week. After trying unsuccessfully to pursue and identify him, she turns to Holmes to help solve the mystery. After some ineffective sleuthing by Watson and some fisticuffs between Holmes and Woodley in the local pub, we discover that poor old Uncle Ralph wasn't so poor after all, and also not quite as dead as Woodley and Carruthers originally told Violet. However, this charming duo knew that Ralph was coming close to his expiration date, and that he planned to leave his considerable fortune to Violet. And what better way to get control of a young lady's inheritance than to marry her? So on the trip back to England, our 2 adventurers play cards to see who will marry Violet when the time comes, and the horrid Mr. Woodley is the lucky winner. However, Violet spurns his advances, and Mr. Carruthers falls in love with her himself, resolving to keep her out of Woodley's clutches. When the 2 receive word that Uncle Ralph has finally shuffled off this mortal coil, Woodley takes matters into his own hands, kidnapping Violet from the lonely stretch of road and forcibly marrying her with the help of a defrocked cleric. Holmes and Watson are just in time to disrupt the happy occasion, which ends with Woodley wounded and Holmes explaining to him how serious a felony this forced marriage really is, while waiting for the local authorities to come and do the final cleanup. This is another of the happy ending stories, with Violet bringing an unexpectedly large dowry to her voluntary marriage to Cyril, and the wrongdoers all receiving their appropriate comeuppance. but it also serves as another cautionary tale about the hazards of a large inheritance to a young lady in Victorian times. While money is a strong motivator, it's not the only one. Some of the most dramatic characters in the canon have spent years, even decades, plotting their revenge for the death of a loved one, while others don't wait nearly that long. The novel that introduced Holmes and Watson to the reading public is a complicated tale of revenge involving another forced marriage, this time leading to fatal results all around. The tale begins in the Mormon territory around Salt Lake, Utah, many years ago, possibly before Holmes and Watson were even born. The young and stalwart Jefferson Hope and the young and beautiful Lucy Ferrier are planning to marry, but the Mormon elders intend Lucy for one of their own, primarily to get their hands on Lucy's father's fortune. The young couple's escape plan is foiled, Lucy's father is murdered, and Lucy is married off to Enoch Drebber. The emotional trauma sends her into a swift decline, and she's dead within a month, leaving Jefferson Hope vowing to avenge his beloved no matter what it takes. Year after year, decade after decade, he pursues Drebber and his sidekick Stangerson across America and Europe, finally catching up to them in London at the beginning of Holmes's career. Not content to simply shoot them and be done with it, he forces Drebber into a sort of Russian roulette game involving two identical pills, one harmless and one deadly poison. Of course, Drebber picks wrong, and Hope has the satisfaction of watching him take his final breaths, knowing that his sins have at last caught up with him. In the excitement, Hope suffers a nosebleed, and not wanting to let good blood go to waste, uses it to scrawl Rache on the wall. When Holmes recognizes the German word for revenge, he has his first clue at the beginning of his long and glorious career. Even in this earliest Holmes tale, a lot of the romance elements are already developed. The virtuous young lady, her stalwart beau, the dastardly villain, foiling their pure romance for his own selfish ends. In The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, another desperate man avenges the death of his lover in an exotic and convoluted way, but he does so within days rather than decades. In an isolated house on the desolate Cornish moor, Brenda Tregennis is found dead with an expression of unbearable horror on her face, while her two brothers have suddenly become raving madmen. There is nothing to indicate, at least to the official police, what could possibly have caused such sudden madness and death. But fortunately, Holmes and Watson just happen to be vacationing in the neighborhood, and of course they become involved immediately. As Holmes is pondering the puzzle, another eccentric neighbor, the famous African explorer and lion hunter, Dr. Leon Sterndale, approaches him to see whether he's made any advances in the case. Perhaps he shouldn't have been so quick to attract Holmes's attention. The very next day, the surviving brother, Mortimer Tregennis, is also found dead in his rented room with the same horrified expression as his sister, giving Holmes another crime scene to investigate. With the help of some powder scraped from the lamp in Mortimer's room, he tries an experiment that conclusively identifies the cause of death as the combustion of this substance, but that also very nearly kills both him and Watson in the process. Now that he has completed, and barely survived, his investigation, he's ready to confront our lion hunter with the evidence of his guilt in at least one of the deaths. Faced with Holmes's seeming omniscience, Dr. Sterndale owns up and explains his actions. It turns out that he and Brenda Tregennis have been in love for many years, but unable to do anything about it because Sterndale is already married to another woman who has left him, but whom he cannot divorce due to the deplorable laws of England. So he's been living in Cornwall when not in Africa and staying friendly with the Tregennis brothers just to remain close to Brenda. It also turns out that just before the destruction of the Tregennis household, Mortimer pumped Sterndale for information about an exotic powder from Africa known as devil's foot to the Africans, but unknown to European science. The powder is used as an ordeal poison by African shamans and produces madness and death in all who inhale the products of its combustion. Upon hearing of the death of Brenda, Sterndale immediately realizes that Mortimer must have stolen some of the powder and used it to try to murder his siblings to gain control over their share of the family fortune. Understandably upset over this ending to his years of waiting for Brenda, he decides to subject Mortimer to the same fate, but he doesn't count on Holmes unraveling the scheme so quickly. It's a good thing for him that upon hearing the true motive for the crime, Holmes decides not to involve the police, but to let Sterndale return to Africa. In seeking Watson's approval of this decision, he reveals a bit of his own heart when he says, "I have never loved, Watson, but if I did, and if the woman I loved met such an end, I might act even as our lawless lion hunter has done." Greed and vengeance drive plenty of crimes, but the jealous lovers in the canon create some of Holmes's most convoluted puzzles. Interestingly, when the motive is greed or revenge, most of the crimes are committed by men, but when jealousy enters the picture, it's often the ladies who exhibit the worst behavior. When jealousy comes into the heart of a creature of the tropics, a child of the sun and of passion, she will go to remarkable lengths to destroy her imagined rival, even in the midst of taking her own life. Our passionate Brazilian is the unhappy wife of Mr. Neil Gibson, the notoriously ruthless Gold King and American senator. This story efficiently illustrates Victorian stereotypes of both North and South Americans. Anyway, poor Mrs. Gibson has lost the love of her husband as she has aged, and the initial tropical passion has waned, although only on his side. She's as much in love as ever and devastated when she sees that her husband seems to have transferred his affections to the family's lovely young governess. When she's found shot to death on a bridge on the Gibson estate, the governess, Grace Dunbar, is charged with her murder based on some very damning evidence, including a note from Grace clutched in Mrs. Gibson's hand and a revolver with one shot fired found in Grace's wardrobe. Mr. Gibson, who actually is in love with Grace, turns to Holmes to try to prove that Grace is innocent. With his usual astute reasoning, Holmes manages to prove that Mrs. Gibson conceived and executed a twisted scheme to commit suicide and frame Grace for her death. Like in The Adventure of the Devil's Foot, Holmes uses minute observation plus experimentation to solve the crime, but the experiment this time is far less hazardous. First, he notices a small chip in the stonework of the bridge near Mrs. Gibson's body. Then, using Watson's revolver, a ball of twine, and a big rock, he reproduces the method Mrs. Gibson used to shoot herself and conceal the suicide weapon by letting it be whisked over the bridge railing into the water. It's hard to imagine being so maddened by the throes of jealousy as to be ready to kill oneself, and at the same time so coolly calculating as to devise such an ingenious scheme. But that's that passionate tropical nature for you. In The Adventure of the Three Gables, it's the young man who is jealous, with good cause, but the lady who commits most of the bad behavior. Isadora Klein is one of Doyle's adventuresses, partly in the Irene Adler mode, but nowhere near as amiable, talented, or accomplished as Miss Adler. While Irene is probably the most celebrated female character in the canon, and even familiar to many non-Sherlockians, Isadora has sunk into well-deserved obscurity. Having married and then buried an extremely wealthy husband, Isadora has been amusing herself with a series of young lovers. But Douglas Maberly is not one to let his affections be toyed with. When Isadora decides to toss him aside so she can marry another extremely wealthy husband, he refuses to go quietly. After she has her gang of thugs rough him up outside her window, he decides to get his revenge by publishing a damning novel with her as the barely disguised villainess. Fearing that such a scandal would cause her prospective, extremely wealthy husband to have second thoughts, she sets out to acquire and destroy the manuscript. By this time, poor Douglas has succumbed to pneumonia, and his personal effects have all been shipped to his mother, who has no idea that this manuscript exists. Isadora, assuming that the manuscript will be in Douglas's belongings, decides to try to buy out Mrs. Maberly, house, furnishings, luggage, and all. It is this strange proposition that sends Mrs. Maberly to Holmes. After the purchase scheme falls through, Isadora's thugs try the direct approach and rob the house, but leave behind the last page of the manuscript in the ensuing struggle with Mrs. Maberly. This is enough to put Holmes on the track to figuring out the case and confronting Isadora. But as he sometimes does, Holmes decides not to involve the police and settles for essentially blackmailing Isadora into financing Mrs. Maberly's long-wished-for trip around the world. To me, this is one of the less satisfying of the Holmes stories, but I do appreciate that Conan Doyle, as an author, had such faith in the power of literature. We've seen greed, jealousy, and revenge push our characters to extremes of behavior. These are all common emotions we've felt ourselves, but hopefully without acting on them quite so nefariously. But sometimes love can make people do things that are just plain, well, weird. In The Adventure of the Creeping Man, poor old Professor Presbury just wants to feel like a match for his beautiful young fiancée. He's so much in love that he's willing to try a very sketchy medical intervention, monkey extract injections, to recover his lost youth. Instead, he becomes a grotesque simian parody of himself. This is not usually the best way to a young girl's heart. After Holmes discovers the source of the professor's horrifying transformation, he muses that the real source lies, of course, in that untimely love affair which gave our impetuous professor the idea that he could only gain his wish by turning himself into a younger man. Clearly, embarking on a May-December romance can have some bizarre consequences. Even among stories of crime starring the most unromantic of heroes, we can find some happy endings if we look. And some of the happier stories don't even have real crimes or real villains, just a couple of pompous fools. No discussion of romance in the canon would be complete without a mention of Irene Adler and that pompous fool, the King of Bohemia. Although she is the daintiest thing under a bonnet on this planet, as the idlers in the Serpentine Mews all agree, Miss Adler has lived a scandalous life by Victorian standards. Since she's from New Jersey, that shouldn't be too surprising. Among her indiscretions is an ill-advised liaison with the aforementioned king. Apparently both parties have moved on, since the king is now engaged to a princess of Scandinavia, and Irene is keeping company with young Godfrey Norton, a respectable lawyer. However, Irene still has a very compromising photograph of herself with the king, and he fears that she will use it to disrupt the royal engagement. Since all his efforts to recover the photo have failed, he turns to Holmes to try to retrieve it. But this is one of the few times when Holmes has an opponent who can stay one step ahead of him. Although Holmes tricks Irene into revealing the location of the photograph, Irene still manages to escape to parts unknown with both the picture and her brand new husband, leaving behind only a different picture and a somewhat mocking letter. It's happy endings all around as Irene marries the man she really loves, the king is free to marry his princess on Irene's assurance that she no longer cares to disrupt his life, and Holmes receives a much-needed lesson in humility. As Watson puts it, he used to make merry over the cleverness of women, but I have not heard him do it of late. And when he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always under the honorable title of the woman. Our next pompous fool is Lord St. Simon, the noble and very self-important bachelor of the title. And once again, the lady in the case is an American, but from California rather than New Jersey. Miss Hattie Doran grew up wild and free in the California mining camps before her father made his fortune in gold, headed for England, and bagged a titled son-in-law. But unbeknownst to both father and bridegroom, Hattie had already secretly married her true love, Frank Moulton, back in California a few years earlier. Unfortunately, while off seeking his fortune, her secret husband fell afoul of an Apache raiding party and was reported dead, leaving Hattie to resign herself to marrying for a title instead of for love. But come the morning of her second wedding, who should show up in the front pew but Frank, back from the dead. He slips Hattie a note in her bouquet, she slips away from the wedding breakfast to join Frank, and Lord St. Simon slips into high dudgeon over being treated so disgracefully. He then enlists Holmes's help to track down his runaway bride. With his powers of deduction and a little help from Inspector Lestrade, Holmes pieces together the story, finds the reunited couple, and gathers all the participants at Baker Street for the big reveal. So we have a happy ending for Hattie and Frank, but what about poor Lord St. Simon? Based on his behavior throughout the story, I think we can rest assured that his vanity was wounded far more seriously than his heart. The happiest ending in the entire canon takes place in The Sign of Four, in which Watson meets and ultimately marries Mary Morstan. He is smitten right away, saying, "In an experience of women which extends over many nations and 3 separate continents, I have never looked upon a face which gave a clearer promise of a refined and sensitive nature." At the end of a long, convoluted plot, a fortune in stolen jewels, which should have gone to Mary, ends up at the bottom of the Thames instead. But rather than mourning the loss, Mary is happy that a potential difference in financial status no longer stands between her and Dr. Watson. It's no wonder that Watson exclaims, Whoever had lost a treasure, I knew that night that I had gained one, just as we lucky readers have gained a treasure in the ageless adventures of Holmes and Watson.